Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights. And welcome back to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I'm your host, Michael Clogs. Privacy is something that at times we forget to protect. It is something valuable that we don't actually learn to respect until we've had a loss of it. And somebody has breached our privacy and managed to be able to sell or act in a manner that violates our privacy, and we realize that shouldn't have happened the way it did. Such is the case with Home Depot when we went through the checkout and we paid for our items, and they asked, hey, would you like to have your receipt emailed to you, or should we print a paper one right now? For those of us who opted to have the email receipt, that we didn't know that our email was going to be now delivered to the company that owns Facebook, Meta. That with that we could be marketed to by Meta for other products, or that it would become part of an analysis of how well Home Depot's marketing plan was actually working. We didn't know what was going to become of that data when our personal data, email, when we said yes to an email receipt. That is a violation of privacy, and believe it or not, there is a privacy commission that actually watches over violations of our privacy, interruptions where our privacy should have been protected and should have been looked over. So we're going to hear from that privacy commission as they actually investigated, reported back to Home Depot about their practice of having a third party look at email data that had been collected as they were sending a receipt to their customers. So let's listen to what the Privacy Commission actually has to say about what happened and what they're going to do to ensure that other companies protect our privacy as we're shopping.
Good morning. We are joined today by Canada's Privacy Commissioner Philippe Dufresne, who will begin with an opening statement, and then we'll take some questions. Mr. Dufresne.
Bonjour à tous. Merci beaucoup pour votre présence aujourd'hui. Je suis heureux d'être ici pour ma première conférence de presse en tant que commissaire à la protection de la vie privée du Canada. Mon mandat est de protéger et de promouvoir le droit à la vie privée des individus dans les secteurs publics et privés et de m'assurer que les organisations respectent leurs obligations à cet égard. Le commissariat enquête sur des plaintes, fournit des conseils aux ministères et aux organisations du secteur privé, sensibilise la population aux enjeux de vie privée et formule des avis et des recommandations au Parlement sur la réforme législative et sur des enjeux de vie privée qui revêtent un intérêt et une importance considérables pour le public. Depuis ma nomination en juin dernier, j'ai rencontré des intervenants clés partout au Canada, représentant le gouvernement, les entreprises, la société civile, les consommateurs, le milieu universitaire et les groupes en quête d'équité. Et l'un des thèmes récurrents lors des discussions était le suivant: la protection de la vie privée dans un monde de plus en plus tourné vers le numérique constitue l'un des principaux défis de notre époque. As Privacy Commissioner of Canada, I fully intend to meet this challenge, and in doing so, I will apply the three elements of my vision for privacy, which are, first, privacy is a fundamental right. It must be legally protected with a strong, fair, accessible, and enforceable rights-based regime that offers meaningful remedies to prevent and address violations and that acts as an incentive for institutions to create a culture of privacy with privacy by design and privacy by default. Second, privacy supports the public interest and Canada's innovation and competitiveness. It is not an either-or proposition. Organizations that choose to consider privacy implications at the outset of any innovation or initiative and that make it easy for Canadians to choose privacy protection as the default setting will find that it is ultimately more cost-efficient and effective, and those costs will become investments that are good for consumers, businesses, public policy, and innovation alike. Third and finally, privacy accelerates the trust that Canadians have in their institutions. When individuals are reassured that their privacy is being sufficiently protected, they feel confident about participating freely in the digital economy. Cette vision repose sur le fait que les Canadiennes et les Canadiens veulent pouvoir participer activement et en toute connaissance de cause au monde numérique, à la société et à l'économie, sans être obligés de choisir entre cette participation et leur droit fondamental à la vie privée. Comme vous le savez, c'est la semaine de la protection des données et aujourd'hui, nous avons publié les résultats de notre enquête sur la communication par Homedepot du Canada à Meta Platforms, la société mère de Facebook, de renseignements sur des clients. Notre principale conclusion à cet égard permet de rappeler à toutes les organisations qu'au moment où les clients demandent un reçu électronique au lieu d'un reçu papier, ils ne consentent pas forcément à ce que leurs renseignements personnels soient communiqués à des tiers. Since at least 2018, Homedepot had been collecting customer email addresses at store checkouts for the stated purpose of providing customers with an electronic copy of their receipt. It is a question that I'm sure all of us recall having been asked at one point or another. Would you like a printed or email receipt? When offered this choice, most customers likely understand that this is for their benefit and convenience in this increasingly digital world. Canadians would likely not expect or accept that their personal information would be shared with a third party like Facebook simply because they opted for an email receipt. However, my office's investigation following a complaint under the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act revealed that Homedepot sent these email addresses in a coded format along with high-level details about each customer's in-store purchases to Meta, who would then use this information to determine if a customer had a Facebook account. If they did, Meta would compare the person's in-store purchases to Home Depot's advertisements sent over the platform to measure and report on the effectiveness of those ads. Meta could also use the information for its own business purposes, including user profiling and targeted advertising that was unrelated to Home Depot. While each email address that Home Depot shared with Meta was encoded so that it could not be read by individuals at Facebook, Meta employed an automated process that allowed it to match email addresses attached to individual Facebook accounts. Lorsqu'on demandait aux clients de Home Depot s'ils souhaitaient recevoir un reçu électronique et que ceux-ci acceptaient, on ne leur disait jamais que leurs renseignements seraient communiqués à Meta et on ne leur fournissait pas d'informations sur la façon dont Meta ou Home Depot utiliseraient leurs renseignements. C'est la raison pour laquelle Home Depot a manqué à ses obligations. Les clients ont besoin de renseignements clairs au moment clé d'une transaction afin de pouvoir prendre des décisions éclairées sur la façon dont leurs renseignements personnels seront utilisés et fournir un consentement valable. J'ai le plaisir de vous informer qu'à la suite des recommandations formulées dans notre rapport, Home Depot a cessé cette pratique en octobre 2022. Home Depot a également confirmé qu'il obtiendra le consentement explicite actif et valable s'il met en place une pratique similaire à l'avenir. Il s'agit là d'un résultat concret, positif pour les Canadiennes et les Canadiens. Personal information is a core part of who we are as individuals, and respecting privacy rights is essential to our dignity and fundamental freedoms. Organizations should not trivialize the use of personal information. While our investigation dealt with an individual case, our overall conclusions would apply to any organization that has a similar practice with respect to e-receipts. This report is a reminder to all companies as they increasingly look to deliver services online and offer e-receipts that they must be clear and transparent about how and why they are asking for consumers' personal information, and that they must obtain meaningful consent from their consumers before sharing this information with third parties. Doing so is not only required by privacy law, it is also an important investment in the trust that Canadians have in the digital economy. Data Privacy Week is also an opportunity to encourage Canadians to always ask companies why and for what purpose their personal information is being sought, even if the request appears to be straightforward. With that, I would be happy to answer your questions. Merci beaucoup.
Okay, we'll move to questions beginning in the room. If you are on the Zoom platform, please raise your hand to be acknowledged. We'll start with Marcia with the Globe and Mail.
Good morning. I had a question if your office has any sense of how many other businesses or what other businesses are using this offline conversions tool when customers enter their email at checkout?
Our investigation focused on one organization, one situation, but our sense is that these tools are widely used, and this is why the message today is that all organizations should review their practices. If they are using similar tools, those conclusions would apply to those practices, and they should take a similar approach.
And just to follow up on a slightly different area, your office has raised issues with government institutions not reporting privacy breaches to your office, including concerns about underreporting specifically around cyber attacks. What needs to happen to ensure that privacy breaches related to cyber attacks specifically are appropriately reported?
We encourage reportings of breaches to our office. It's a policy requirement for the government. We would want to see that be a legal requirement as it is for the private sector. And we're concerned that there may be insufficient reports to our office given that we are hearing more and more about these privacy breaches. And the benefit of notifying our office is we can look into what happened, we can provide advice, we can have lessons learned, and we can ensure that these things don't happen. This causes significant harm to Canadians. And so it is important that we put privacy at the front end, not as a reactive mechanism, but that it be built in the culture of institutions. And reporting privacy breach, obviously preventing them, is part of that culture.
Okay, Mylène?
Bonjour. J'aimerais savoir qu'est-ce que vous pensez du projet de loi C-27. Est-ce que les dispositions qui sont dans ce projet de loi-là contribueraient à éliminer ce genre de pratiques qui ont été adoptées chez Home Depot?
Merci pour la question. Mon bureau, certainement, avant mon arrivée, et moi-même, encourageons et demandons une modernisation des lois en matière de protection de la vie privée, tant pour le secteur public que pour le secteur privé. Et donc, le projet de loi C-27, qui vise à moderniser la loi sur la protection de la vie privée dans le secteur privé, est un développement que nous avons accueilli favorablement et on souhaite que ça progresse au Parlement. Comme vous savez, le projet de loi est toujours devant la Chambre. J'ai hâte de fournir mes avis aux parlementaires sur la manière qui pourront améliorer ce projet de loi-là. Il y a des éléments déjà certainement positifs, notamment l'octroi potentiel de nouveaux pouvoirs à mon bureau. Pour le moment, je n'ai pas l'autorité d'émettre des ordonnances, je n'ai pas l'autorité de recommander des amendes. Le projet de loi C-27 le prévoit et le projet de loi C-27 prévoit aussi des obligations proactives de compagnies de revoir leur politique en matière de vie privée. Alors, j'aurai plus à dire aux parlementaires, j'espère sous peu là-dessus.
Mais est-ce que de ce que vous voyez, ça peut changer cette culture-là chez les entreprises, de dire, ben bon, les gens pouvaient aller voir sur notre site web pour consentir sans vraiment que la clientèle soit au courant de ça ou qu'on les avertisse de ça? Est-ce que vous sentez que les amendes déjà prévues dans ce projet de loi-là sont assez dissuasives puis permettraient cette espèce de changement de culture?
Mais je pense que pour atteindre un changement de culture, il faut utiliser tous les outils. Les amendes, c'est un outil, mais les amendes, c'est quelque chose que j'espère qui sera utilisé dans une minorité de situations parce qu'on va avoir créé une culture de protection de la vie privée. Mais il faut plusieurs outils. Ça aide à attirer l'attention des organisations sur les conséquences, sur les risques. Alors, le pouvoir d'amende, le pouvoir d'émettre des ordonnances, ce sont des choses qui viennent, dans certains cas, accélérer les résultats. C'est important d'avoir des obligations proactives, de créer des programmes de protection de la vie privée. J'ai recommandé publiquement que l'obligation de faire une analyse des effets, des conséquences en matière de vie privée, de consulter mon bureau avant que des nouvelles initiatives soient finalisées et mises en œuvre. Alors, toutes ces choses-là, ce sont des façons de contribuer à cette culture de la vie privée. Mon objectif, c'est qu'on voit la vie privée comme un atout. Ce n'est pas un obstacle à l'innovation, ce n'est pas un obstacle à l'intérêt public, ça vient contribuer à ces éléments-là, ça vient renforcer la confiance, mais il faut absolument le traiter comme un droit fondamental et ça veut dire le traiter de façon prioritaire. Merci.
Okay, David Baxter with Global News.
Hey, good morning, Commissioner. And yeah, no, the response to this question will retread some of the ground you just covered, but just for the sake of having it in English for broadcast there. Just, right now, is there any real recourse you could bring to companies like Home Depot, or would that not be possible until this new legislation passes?
Well, under the Act currently, I have the authority to receive complaints, to investigate complaints, and to issue findings and make recommendations. So we've done that in this case. Home Depot was cooperative in the context of this investigation. They have agreed to our recommendation, and so this is a positive outcome in terms of the practice has ended. But that's not always going to be the case, and so having the authority to issue orders, having the authority to issue or recommend fines in appropriate case would be additional tools that could help. The goal is not to use these in all cases or even in many cases, but the goal is to really recognize in our laws the importance of privacy as a fundamental right. It's not an obstacle to innovation. It's not an obstacle to public interest. It generates trust that Canadians have and need to have in their institutions and the digital economy. And so all those tools are necessary, as is a proactive duty in organizations to establish privacy programs and, in appropriate cases, to go further with privacy impact assessment and consult my office. So there are many tools. They have to be used because privacy is too important to trivialize.
Yeah, and just speaking more generally as well, this case seems like a great example of just how big business, personal data and collection and sharing of personal information online can be. Just given the rapidly evolving nature of the online space, is it a challenge for your office to really keep up with how fast everything changes and like the different ways new methods of data collection and sharing develop online?
Well, my office has technical expertise, and that is in turn evolving with technology. So the real issue is that our laws need to evolve to catch up and adapt to this evolving technology. The public sector privacy legislation is some 40 years old, so it predates the internet. Private sector privacy legislation is 20 years old. So that needs to be modernized to recognize and adapt to the new reality and the fast-paced digital changes. There also needs to be flexibility, whether it's by my office issuing guidance and clarification or government regulations. So there needs a nimbleness so that we don't need legislative amendments through Parliament every time there is new technology. So the law needs to be able to adjust to that, and my office needs to have the resources necessary to do so as well.
Okay, we'll move to the Zoom. Palak Mangat.
Hi, Commissioner. Thanks for taking our questions. You've touched on it, on the fact that, Home Depot may be sort of the tip of the iceberg. I guess my question is just, are there other stores or outlets that you may want to flag or are on your radar or maybe are under investigation that customers need to be aware of, or?
Well, I think in this instance, what we are flagging is the practice. What we are flagging is that in this case, an organization was treating a choice to have an email receipt as opposed to a paper receipt as an implicit consent that if you chose that email receipt, then you were authorizing the organization to share your data with a third party. So we are saying that this practice is not consistent with privacy law. It has to stop. And any and all organizations who have such a practice now have notice that this is a practice that has to end. And so my expectations is that organizations will take the necessary step to bring themselves in compliance, and this is why we are making this outcome public, and I'm grateful for all of you being here today to assist in that.
And just as a follow-up, I know you and your predecessors have also talked about the need to make the office's activities a little bit more proactive. These findings and this report came down as a result of a complaint. So, is there something that's missing to be more to allow your office, to be more proactive? And could there be companies essentially slipping through the cracks that you would like to scrutinize?
Well, proactivity is very important, and you're quite right. There is an ability for individuals to make complaints. Sometimes those complaints are done after an injury has been incurred. And so being proactive, my office has the authority to initiate complaints. The Bill C-27 would provide even a greater ability in terms of organization, creating privacy practices and sharing some of those, sharing codes of practices with my office. So we need to do more. My office needs to have additional and sufficient resources to be able to proactively look into those matters that are significant so that we can proactively deal with them without waiting for a complaint or an issue to become systemic. And so those are all tools that we are exploring, but you're quite right that proactivity is absolutely key.
We'll move to Mike Swift.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. Two quick questions, Commissioner. Did your investigation uncover any evidence that Home Depot had similar practices in other countries, such as the United States, first? And secondly, Meta was one step removed from the customer in this case, but do they bear any legal responsibility under Canadian law for this practice?
In this instance, we focused on Home Depot Canada's practice, and so our comments are focused on that. We're applying the Canadian legislation on their practice, and the focus of our report is really Home Depot's sharing of its customers' information with Meta. Meta is part of the analysis because they were the ones receiving that information. There was an agreement with Home Depot to do so. Both organizations have been cooperative in providing information to my office, but ultimately the complaint in this instance is vis-a-vis Home Depot's sharing of its employee information with Meta. And all organizations who would have similar desire to have contracts with Meta or any other organization of a similar nature ought to look at the report and the recommendations and the requirements of obtaining meaningful consent from your customers before conclusion of the sale and before sharing information in such a manner.
Murad Hamadi.
Maybe I could just ask you to restate that last point you made a little more explicitly. This is a specific program that Home Depot is using with regard to Meta called offline conversions that is an ad attribution program. It's the position of your office. You're saying that any organization subject to PIPEDA in Canada is required to obtain explicit and meaningful consent from customers before sharing information with this program.
In these circumstances, yes. So if an organization has a similar program and a similar mechanism, and we describe that in our report of finding, where there is customers are being offered the choice of a paper or email receipt, and if they choose an email receipt, then that information in a coded format is shared with whether it's Meta in this case or another third party, and then that in turn is used to assess the effectiveness of ads and could in this case be used for other purposes. So any organization who has wants a similar practice and a similar service, they need to obtain meaningful consent from the customer at the front end.
And so just to be clear, this specific use case is with regard to e-receipts, but you're not necessarily speaking to offline conversions as a whole. And just to tack onto that, C27 includes this new CPPA would include a carve out for legitimate interest, so an exception to consent for legitimate interest. Do you think something like this might fall under that? So essentially, is this guidance sort of short term until that bill passes?
Well, we'd have to look at it under C27, under the version that ultimately is adopted, if it is adopted by Parliament. But there are some conditions that are provided under the legitimate interest description in C27. There are some limits as to what can and what cannot be used. There's some discussion in terms of whether it can be used to influence behaviors of individuals. And so it would have to be looked at under that framework, but certainly it is something that is not authorized under PIPEDA, and that is our finding.
Okay, we'll move to Josh Rubin, Toronto Star.
Thanks for taking my questions today. Just trying to understand two things. First of all, who initiated this partnership between Meta and Home Depot, and also was there any financial consideration as opposed to sharing of data?
What we have highlighted in our report, and what is key in this instance, is that Home Depot put in place this practice, whether it was initiated, whether there was an offer of the product by Meta or whether it was sought by Home Depot. The issue is this process was implemented by Home Depot, and this is the way by which the personal information of the customers was shared by Home Depot to Meta. And so what we looked at in our investigation was whether there was meaningful, valid consent of the customer. There was a discussion about whether the privacy policies of Home Depot, the privacy policies of Meta, would have constituted sufficient information for consumers. We found that it did not, for a number of reasons. We found that those policies were not clear enough and understandable enough for consumers. But in any event, when they were buying at the counter, they had no reason to suspect that this information would be shared with Meta, no reason to ask to see Meta's privacy policies, and no reason to go and ask. No one goes and asks to read the privacy policies of an organization when they're being asked for an e-receipt or a paper receipt. And so our message is organizations should make it easy for consumers to understand the privacy implications, and easy for customers to choose privacy protective measures to deal with their data.
So just to be clear, you're saying like you didn't ask because it wasn't part of your mandate, or you don't like. I'm not trying to call you out. I'm just genuinely trying to understand.
What we were investigating in this case was the privacy practice of Home Depot, and ultimately we found that Home Depot did not sufficiently protect its customers' information when it put in place a contract with Meta that allowed Meta to then receive the information of customers asking for e-receipts and authorized Meta to use it for Meta's own purposes. And so we've made recommendations, and we're happy to see that they have been agreed to by Home Depot.
Okay, thanks.
We'll move to Catherine Tunney with CBC.
Hello there. Thanks for taking our questions. My first question is a bit me coming with my tail between my legs because I missed your opening statement, so maybe you addressed this. But do you have any sense of how many Canadians' information, dating back to 2018, was tied up in this program?
Thank you. We don't have a figure on this, but our sense is that there would be many, because it is a very widespread reality of being asked for a paper or online receipts. And so we were dealing with a situation where we had one complainant who was affected by this, but we know that this is occurring or was occurring multiple occasions. And so this is something that we are flagging as something that should be looked at by organizations. And if they are applying similar policies, they need to know that this is not consistent with privacy law.
I was wondering too, the report talks about, the details of purchases, could be highly sensitive when put together with other data. Can you just kind of walk us through, if I buy rat poison or lumber from Home Depot, should I be concerned? Maybe kind of walk us through how those links get made and how eventually sometimes, sensitive information can be kind of put together.
Right. Well, we looked at the issue of whether in this instance the information would be considered to be sensitive information, because sensitivity of information is one of the reasons that would justify requiring an express opt-in consent, as we have done in this case. And we found in this instance it may not be sensitive, the lumber or the types of things, but in this instance, in any event, we found that this was so removed from the reasonable expectation of customers when they were asking for an e-receipt that even if it's not sensitive, you require opt-in consent. But we can imagine situations in other contexts, other types of stores, other types of products where knowing what a person is buying and how often could give a lot of information about that individual that could be sensitive. And the more information you have about an individual, the more you can create an image of that person. And so that's why it is something that absolutely has to be taken seriously by organizations.
And the final question on Zoom is Christopher Nardi, National Post.
Hi there. My question is actually regarding, it's somewhat technical, but I want to understand, by doing this, was Home Depot doing something illegal? You don't say the word illegal in your report. It implies that they were breaking the rules, but ultimately, was this agreement with Meta that they had illegal?
Well, when we receive complaints, whether it's under the Privacy Act or whether it's PIPEDA, the private sector legislation, we look to see if the organization complied with the legal requirements. And in this instance, we found that Home Depot did not comply with the legal requirement of PIPEDA, the Privacy Act, in the private sector, because they did not obtain valid, meaningful consent in this instance, and that's why our conclusion was that the complaint was well-founded. But we also noted that Home Depot had collaborated in the context of the investigation and had accepted our recommendation to end the practice, or if the practice were to be continued or put in place in the future, to put in place mechanisms to ensure that this meaningful opt-in consent is obtained by customers.
Gotcha. That was my only question. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other questions in the room? Okay, well,
Peut-être en
Marcia with the globe.
français, justement, chez
Ah,
Home Depot, là, disons que j'achète un set de patio, là, c'est pas la fin du monde là, que Facebook le sache. Mais je pense que dans d'autres contextes, ça peut être plus sensible. Est-ce que vous pouvez un peu élaborer en français là-dessus?
Oui, tout à fait. Alors, on a regardé parce que la sensibilité de l'information, c'est un des critères pour déterminer est-ce que, oui ou non, on peut accepter un consentement implicite ou est-ce qu'on doit demander un consentement explicite. Plus l'information elle est sensible, bien plus ce sera probable qu'on va aller demander un consentement explicite, proactif, qu'on appelle opt-in en anglais. Mais ce n'est pas le seul critère. Il y a aussi un critère à savoir, est-ce que ça fait partie des attentes raisonnables des gens que leur information serait utilisée? Et on a conclu ici que non, que quand les gens se font demander, est-ce que vous voulez un reçu papier ou un reçu électronique, il n'y a aucune raison pour quelqu'un de présumer que si on choisit le choix du reçu électronique, bien là, on est en train de donner la permission pour que nos données soient partagées avec des tiers, mais que si on choisit un reçu papier, ce n'est pas le cas. Alors, c'est pour cette raison-là qu'on a dit, peu importe que ce soit sensible ou non, on doit obtenir un consentement explicite, proactif. Mais il peut y avoir différents types de transactions. Un patio, peut-être, ce n'est pas sensible, mais encore là, si on achète d'autres types de produits qui peuvent révéler de l'information par rapport à la sexualité des gens ou par rapport à certaines habitudes ou par rapport à certains enjeux, on peut facilement imaginer des situations où nos achats peuvent identifier de l'information à propos de nous qui serait sensible. Alors, c'est une des raisons, puis j'ai conclu dans mes remarques d'introduction que l'information personnelle, la protection de la vie privée, c'est fondamental. Il y a un lien direct avec la dignité des individus et dans une société libre et démocratique, c'est essentiel qu'on le protège.
Okay, Marcia with the globe.
Yeah, I just had one extra question. And I'm curious, the report talks a little bit about consent fatigue, and Home Depot's mention of this as sort of I guess you could call it an argument for not having opt-in consent. Can you talk about why that's not sufficient?
Right. Well, consent fatigue was raised in this context as one of the reasons why customers had not been asked, and we did not accept that argument. And I've indicated that consent fatigue is not a valid reason for failing to obtain meaningful consent. So sometimes consent fatigue can happen because the information provided to customers or the privacy policies is not clear, and it takes a lot of effort to understand what is being done. So I think consent fatigue is not a reason to not obtain meaningful consent. Consent fatigue is a reason to make it even easier for customers to know what organizations want to do with the information, why they need it, what's the purpose, and in cases where they're proposing to share it, with whom and why. And so this is important, and I also encourage Canadians to have the habit to ask those questions, not be afraid to ask those questions to organizations, whether it's in the store or elsewhere. When you're asked for your personal information, having the habit to say, why do you need this information? But the responsibility ultimately rests with organizations to ensure that they treat this information appropriately.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions we have for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you for listening. And, we're glad that we have a privacy commission that actually is looking out for our well-being. But brings about another question. Who is looking out for the Canadian government? Who's watching that the Canadian government isn't violating our privacy also? That our privacy is protected from our own government. That lawmakers, law enforcement aren't able to break into what we think is private and look at us. A lot of people I've been told by a lot of people, oh wow, I don't have anything to hide. We don't have anything to hide until there is actually something to hide, because we didn't realize that they were looking that far in. We're not talking about looking that far in and finding that we've broken a law. We're just looking that far in, and maybe it's something intimate between us and our spouse. Said, oh, they were listening to that. Maybe it's just something that may be a little too private for the rest of the world to know. And maybe we need to ensure that our own government is actually obeying their own privacy rules, regulations, and laws. So, just something to think about when we think about privacy and our own government. Well, again, thank you for listening today. You've been listening to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I've been your host, and it's been great speaking with you and broadcasting to you. And at this point, I do want to ask that you, if you haven't already, push that subscription button on whatever that platform is that you're listening. We can be found on Spotify, Spreaker, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and hundreds or more of platforms around the world where we appear to help bring comments on different policies and how politics happens around the world and human rights around the world. Have a great day. This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.